Y'all ever do the office politics thing? You know, the one where you got to pretend you like stuff you don't like very much, because if you don't act like you like it, then you're getting in trouble. You're going to run afoul of somebody, and that stuff, it's going to come back to haunt you later. Maybe you have to do that in some social circles, or act like you're mad about things that actually deep down you're not that mad about. There's this age-old human tradition, right, of throwing in with whatever is winning, because there will be consequences sometimes if you don't throw in with whatever is winning. And this was very common in the various vignettes of court drama that we see from the history of the whole world. And this isn't just like a Western thing. This is an everywhere thing. This transcends human nature. We see it in ancient India and China and feudal Japan. We see it in sub-Saharan Africa. We see it in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Rome and Greece and in current American politics, just everywhere. And the way this works is that you have certain powerful people who are all involved in the room of nobility or decision-making, whatever you want to call it, the royal court. And everybody either has an arrow that is pointing up or an arrow that is pointing down. And you want to try to position yourself to be on the side of the people for whom the arrow is pointing up, especially if you live in a time where if the arrow points up too much for one particular player in the game, they get to take revenge on everybody they don't like, dispossess them of their property or maybe their heads, whatever it might be. And it's really comical when you go back and you look at this kind of dynamic amongst the social power brokers. When you go back and look at it through history, it's very, very funny because you're removed from the pressure, right? So you can afford to just laugh at these silly gooses and how they could all say the emperor is wearing fine clothing when in fact the emperor has no clothes. They could all gather around sycophantically, all these highly educated, super wealthy, influential people, and be like, wow, this is so important. And I'm so glad you've raised awareness about this. We all need to do something, but nobody means it. It's a fraud. People just go along with the trendy thing sometimes because they feel like they need to do that. I think we're seeing a scene like that unfold between Esther chapter 3 and Esther chapter 9. Now, yesterday, we were talking about how the main drama, the interpersonal drama of Esther, is mostly done. That runs up to the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 and chapter 10, which is teeny tiny, just tagged on to the very end. These two chapters are more mop-up. They're the expected conclusions to everything that happened, and they serve a functional purpose for later readers to understand how the holiday that still exists to this day that commemorates these events came to exist and why the dynamics of that holiday are what they are. So tonally, we're in a little bit of a different place. And as I admitted yesterday, the first 8 chapters of Esther, they have a few moments that go down a little weird for me as a modern reader with modern sensibilities. Most of those I can imagine the Iron Age, and I can kind of picture what this was like. Chapter 9, it's a little bit tougher for me to square that with my modern sensibilities, but we'll work through it together and we're going to have a good time. And I mentioned yesterday that there are 2 types of dynamics that are in play here. I think I mentioned it yesterday. If not, I'm going to mention it right now. One dynamic that we're going to see in chapter 9 is the dynamic between the Jews and the people who wanted to kill the Jews, right? I mean, obviously that dynamic must have existed, and some people are going to pretend to like Jewish things all of a sudden. Others are just going to not come out and fight on the fight day. Others are going to still see if they can just come out and win. Maybe they painted themselves into a corner verbally. Maybe they boasted haughtily, and maybe they rounded people up and tried to create some sort of anti-Jew club so that they would all be ready to go when the appointed day came around. And then when the counter edict came out, they were like, well, I can't really undo my anti-Jew club. So there's that. There's the social dynamic amongst all the people, and we're going to see a bunch more about that and how it plays out. But then there's also the dynamic that we don't see quite as much, which happens among the noble people. It just gets a little nod right here, but I think it's one of those moments where we see that goofy pretend to like things and try to throw in with whoever you think is on a rocket, whoever you think is winning kind of dynamic that we get amongst the powerful leaderly types. So let's look at that and have a laugh at the fancy wig-wearing political leader types that are so easy to lampoon here right now. I'm just going to go from the beginning of Esther 9, because I think that sets it up a little better. So here we go. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. Okay, so far, by the way, I got no problem with that. I don't feel any squeamishness at all. It's easy. Haman tried to get them all killed. People wanted to kill the Jews. The Jews now have permission to fight back, and dang it, they're going to win. I mean, what would I do if I were in their position? Exactly that, because of how much I like being alive and how much I like my family and my community. I get it. Everything there, cool. I mean, it just makes perfect sense, right? Okay, verse 3. And all the nobles of the provinces, you got to say nobles more nasally. Let me try it again. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. You people are so unprincipled. You don't believe in anything at all. You are so buried. You have your head so far up the butt of court power that you can't think straight anymore. You don't believe anything at all. Morality is whatever makes sense today for this type of ruling class. Do you remember? Let me just see how many pages it is to go back to when they held completely different convictions. All right, there's 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages. It was 3 pages ago. These people all were like, yeah, well, we're going to have to, I mean, there's a troublesome group there that Haman, they're bad. The king's edict, Haman has a lot of power and he wouldn't make a bad edict on behalf of the king. I mean, there's just a troublesome people group that doesn't obey the norms or the traditions or the laws of the king. We're just going to have to kill all the Jews. This is the right thing to do, and we just have to do it. And anybody who's opposed to this is a dangerous conspiracy theorist who just isn't listening to the science and what is the true and obvious consensus that the experts have arrived at about what people group we have to eradicate. Look, maybe it's unfortunate, but these are the times and the matter is settled. Folks, we hear your concerns, but at this point, if you raise any more of them, you would have to be branded as someone who's dangerously opposed to the will of the king and the people. And for the time being, we've tolerated you. And we've allowed that, but that time has come to a close. So we're going to have to do this thing. What did they really think? That Haman's super powerful, that he has the upper hand, that he just crafted new morality, and none of them have the courage to do anything about it, despite the nod that we get at the end of Esther chapter 3, where Haman and the king send out this issue, and they're like, clink, clink, let's have a drink, bro. But the city of Susa is bewildered. Well, presumably a whole lot of Persia was bewildered by this. But the governors and the satraps and all the royal administrator types, they went along with it. We don't have any record in between here of somebody being like, that's just straight up murder. And weren't these people totally favored by the king just like a minute ago? What are we doing? No, nobody was like that. They could tell who had the upper hand, and so they just threw in with him and were like, yeah, great, let's go. Well, now Mordecai has the upper hand, suckers. And all of these deeply principled wig-wearing, I don't know that they actually wore wigs. That's what I picture when I picture the fancy elites. They got pants that have a huge front area to the pant and maybe a couple of buttons. And they have a jacket, and the jacket has tails, and their wig is very, very powdered. And maybe they have a little bit of pink makeup on their cheeks. That's who I picture when I picture real fancy elites. But whatever the Persian equivalent of that is, that's how all of these fancies are dressed up. And now all of a sudden they got to get out and do their stupid political speech where they pretend like they have principles. And they're like, well, folks, I'm the satrap of this satrapy, and the clear and obvious moral thing for us to do is to have the Jews fight back against Haman and his ilk. here coming up in a few days. And that's just what we have to do. It's so ridiculous. I'm sure they tried to memory hole their support for Haman that existed just once again 3 pages earlier. Why? Well, they supported Haman earlier, not because of principle, because they were afraid of Haman. Now they're supporting Mordecai, not because they suddenly love the Jews. Maybe a few people at the end of chapter 8 came to love the Jews or the God of Abraham, and maybe they legitimately came around. But these governors, these people are pragmatic 11 out of 10, and whatever is expedient is their new foundational, moral, inarguable principle. But it's really all about fear, keeping their power, getting more money, and playing their stupid Game of Thrones at the expense of all of their underlings that they don't actually care very much about. And so, now that fear of Mordecai has seized them, oh, how their tone has changed. And this is a really important detail politically, I think, to note, just in terms of the anatomy of how this whole thing worked out. Maybe it's one more place where we need to pause and acknowledge the sovereignty of God here. What we're seeing is another reversal. They were all afraid of Haman before. Now they're all afraid of Mordecai. They acted against the Jews before. Their new fear is prompting them to act in favor of the Jews. And really, when you read a document like Esther that's built the way Esther is built, I think it's okay to be like, you know what? I don't care what your stupid motivations are. You guys have been clown rulers the whole time. This is part of the clown king motif of the entire Bible. And whatever, do it out of cowardice. It doesn't matter. Just be on the side of what is right here, and the side of what is right is whatever is in opposition to Haman's awful edict from earlier. And so it's not just Xerxes who has at least a paper change of heart. It is also all of his administrators and all of the levels of the grand bureaucracy built by Xerxes' father, Darius, the great administrator, that now are fully weaponized against the enemies of the Jews and in favor of Mordecai and the Jews. Weird way to get there, exploiting the low character, unprincipled, fickle, expedient morality and almost non-existent courage levels of all of these leaders. But that's how we get here. And the result, through the eyes of the person who wrote the book of Esther, is to be celebrated. The Jews don't just have the freedom to fight back, but now they actually have the backing of all of these leaders as they get into this decisive day, a day we will talk more about tomorrow. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.